Today I wanted to talk a little about the meaning in metaphor and its utility compared to literal or logical thinking. In particular, of course, and ultimately to find out the meaning of a topic or concept like wisdom. The oldest forms of metaphorical understanding about the world are actually the most deepest and complex stories, philosophical stories that we have before the advent of sophisticated writing, which came along with civilization. These being myths and fairy tales. Fairy tales being, I guess, the myths that survived in Christian times, or it's the variants of them, after the religious belief in paganism died away. The stories told in mythology often take new forms in the form of fairy tales and folk tales, folklore. This is evident in the fact that many archetypes and concepts existent in medieval folklore actually have their roots in ancient paganism. For example, this idea of the fairies in Irish folklore, the Sheha, themselves being descended from the old gods, the Tuatha Dé Danann. That's a very clear example. While belief in the gods has disappeared, the stories about fairies and leprechauns and whatnot contain many of the same archetypes that the older myths had. There's one Nordic folk tale or folk concept about this queen of the ice, and she's a personification of the winter forces, I guess, the spread of the ice across the land during the winter, and she's this desolate, sort of lonely, bereft character mourning this summer. During the winter she's alone in like this fortress of ice and whatnot, crying tears of ice and whatnot. And of course in the summer then she becomes an ordinary person or whatnot, and there's a curse put on her that she has to live in the ice every winter and whatnot. This would be part of a folktale which seems almost childish, designed for children, but at the same time clearly has a lot of deeper meaning in it. In fact, there's a connection here to the story about Persephone, how she has to spend every winter with Hades in the underworld before she can rejoin her family again in the summer. It's a very similar archetype. When thinking about things logically and completely rationally and literally, by the book, each concept and definition being what can be defined by the book, say a dictionary. There's a great limitation here, because of course we do not have concepts for everything in language, and there are linguistic limitations to our understanding. So the inability to think metaphorically actually limits the conceptuality of the philosopher, because in a logical dialogue, all realizations must be spurned from axioms which are assumed at the start. In logic you must assume certain things to be true. Much like in science, you must put forth a hypothesis based on things you know. This is an axiom in mathematics, and the same word axiom can be used to describe, the logical input. But if a realization grander than what we already know, than what can already be derived from what we know, rather, is not contained within that logical input, it cannot be produced in the output. Metaphorical understanding allows concepts to be characterized, personified, aggrandized. It allows us to connect with and understand minute concepts which language would not really allow us to understand. So if you were to take the idea of intelligence, knowledge, wisdom, many people think wisdom itself is a combination of intelligence and knowledge. it's somehow, well, by the book it would be the estimation of all knowledge you've learned in your life, and the ability to apply it makes you wise. But wisdom, to me, or at least one refrain of wisdom, goes a lot further. And in folk stories, sorry, I got interrupted there. The phone ran out of space. As I was saying, in folk tales, when an animal is chosen to be depicted as wise, it's always a predatory animal. For example, an owl, a wolf, fox, a lion. The wise animals, the hawk, sometimes a serpent. All wise animals are predatory animals. And this connection is made by children when they're young without any influence. I remember when I was young thinking the crow was a wise animal, etc. It's never the rabbit, the deer, the sheep, the cow. These animals aren't wise. It's always a predatory animal. And I think the best example of this in human beings is the example of Aristotle. Aristotle would debate people who seemed like sort of nerds to him, because they would study everything that had been written that was worth studying, and they seemed to know everything inside out. But Aristotle would come up with these ideas which mostly by science would be false, but people loved Aristotle's ideas, and Aristotle's ideas were used for centuries, maybe even 1,000 years after his death, even though according to science, literally they were false ideas. The idea of the four humours, for example, which was used in medieval times. I mean, it wouldn't have been used if it didn't work to some degree, you know. Of course, according to science, this is wrong. There are no such things as the four humours. But this is because Aristotle was a bodybuilder. Now, Aristotle would debate people and he'd tower over them, and he was twice as strong as them. He could pick them up and throw them across the room. And whatever you say about Aristotle's knowledge of the science and how accurate scientifically what he was saying was, Aristotle appeared much wiser than anyone else in the room, on the basis that he was every day pushing his physical endurance to the limit in order to become stronger. This is something which spiritually it proves the strength of soul and character in a person. Anybody can learn what they're told, you become very knowledgeable, but unless you learned it by your own merit, you are not wise. And this is one concept which it must be understood with metaphor, because literally, of course, an old person is wise. Literally, the school teacher is wise. Your parents are wise. But there's further meaning in wisdom. It's the ability to apply not what you've learned, but what you've learned by merit, what you've learned through struggle. And the wise are always conquerors. They are always people who have struggled a lot. Whether it be talking about saints or, say for example, the god Odin is the god of wisdom, and he became wise through very obvious, clear, metaphorical suffering. Suffering that so much that it mutilated him, it inhibited him physically. But he became wise from that struggling and suffering. And it's the same idea of the saintly figure who learns secrets by going through various trials and struggles and suffering in order to somehow overcome himself. And the reason why this concept exists, even if you can say that the miracles don't exist, that the magic never really was there, if you wanted to say that literally, scientifically, one thing is true is that there is that extra element to wisdom. And the archetype existed, and there are plentiful examples of it, and it's applied in so many different ways. again, Aristotle is a great example of it. And the way I see it, that's just the best example of how a metaphorical understanding is necessary to understand the true value of concepts. I could go on and talk more about folk tales and metaphorical meaning, but that's mostly what I wanted to say. So, that's it.